Now, the Ys series debuted way back in the 1980s on a Japanese home console that's commonly known as the PC-88. And since that time, the series cemented itself as one of the premier JRPG series from back in the day, which eventually also localized to Western territories. Some of the aspects of the original Ys games that players could expect was unique gameplay mechanics that really set the series apart from some of its competitors, in addition to giving a great open-world fantasy adventure to experience. And even with the limited sound hardware that was available at the time, they were still able to incorporate some great compositions with thrilling melodies that really paired well with the overall experience. There have since been 17 releases in the Ys franchise, which comprise of basically 11 wholly unique games. And throughout the years, the Ys series has transformed itself and quickly became one of the most important Japanese action RPG series on the market today. It's been my experience that each new game continues to push the series forward and gives us something as the fans to be excited about. So join me as I embark on a tedious adventure of my own, ranking the series from worst to best to find out what, in my opinion, is the strongest in the series. So this is going to be a very special Toostupidgamerz video and a first ever for the channel, being that at the end of the month, Ys X Nordics is releasing worldwide for the first time. We felt the need to go ahead and do a special video commemorating this time. But first, before we get into this, I just wanted to throw out a couple of quick disclaimers. The first, most important one, is that Ys 5 will not be appearing on this list. The reason for this is that it never got localized, and it wasn't until recently that I found out of the existence of a fan translation. So without actually having played the game, it doesn't make sense for me to include it here because I really wouldn't be able to say much about it. And the next disclaimer is that Falcom has re-released some of these games, so there is a chance that I'm talking from the perspective of someone that played a different version of the game from you. For example, I never played the original Ys 3, but I did play Oath in Felghana, which is a remake of 3. So just be mindful that I'm speaking from the point of view, the experience that I have playing the versions of the games that I played. And lastly, this goes without saying, but these are just my opinions. Just because your favorite Ys game didn't make it as high on this list does not mean that we're telling you that you're wrong. These are just my thoughts. All of these games are incredibly fun and deserve your time, so go ahead, enjoy the ones that you enjoy, and let us know in the comments below how you agree or disagree with some of our choices. And with all of that out of the way, we're gonna start off with number 9. And we'll have to start with the doozy. Again, mind you, this list excludes 5, but I am going to open with Ys 8 at the very start of this list. I know, hate me in the comments, although I don't deserve it, and I'll tell you why. I can't tell you specifically what I wasn't feeling about this game, but a bunch of little nitpicks combined with overall the game taking a direction I wasn't expecting made it a no-brainer to rank this game as the lowest. Now, some of the nice things I could say about it is that at the very least, it's a lot like a Ys game should be, gameplay-wise. And you can also pretty much just ignore the tower defense stuff if that kills the experience for you too, but I thought it added variety and was enjoyable. I can also say that the soundtrack is amazing, but unfortunately, that applies to every last game on this list too. That's also something that I'm going to try to be mindful of when I'm going through this list, but yeah, every game in the Ys series has a great soundtrack. The old games with the bits and boops sound great, as well as all of the games that have come out since that time. So there's really not much to say that, hey, this is a Ys game, is a great soundtrack, because they all have great soundtracks. The main thing that I'm going to focus on in this video is the parts of each game that stand out and separate themselves from each other, as well as all of the non-soundtrack elements. Gameplay, story, visuals, you name it. That's what I'm going to focus on mainly, but soundtrack is still such a core important part of the Ys series. But this entry sits as the lowest regarded Ys game for me, primarily because overall it was not too interesting. It felt kind of slow with the story, and worse so, there weren't really any towns for you to visit throughout the game. We're basically on an adventure here where Adel wakes up on an island and goes all castaway on us. Or actually it would be more like lost because there's a lot of other people. But the overall emptiness of the island with not having a lot of places to go full of townsfolk like is usual with the series made it feel less like the type of grand adventure that I was hoping for. The strongest thing Ys 8 has going for it is the gameplay and the soundtrack. There's no complaints from me there. As I said before, there is a tower defense component to the game. It doesn't feel like it needs to be there, but luckily for us, it's not too bad, and it's also mostly optional. Don't get me wrong, Ys 8 is a solid entry and a popular starting point for new fans of the series. It's just that for me, it's personally the lowest in the series. And what could follow 8 better than 9? Unfortunately, the last two games have left me a little bit disappointed despite still being very solid titles on their own. I think in an attempt to modernize the experience you get in a Ys game, they started to change things up with the formula as the series has aged, which has led to less than desirable consequences. Ys 9 is actually a very cool game that I would recommend if you already like JRPGs. It's just at times a tiny bit dull, it's buggy, and oftentimes it's alien enough that I forget I'm playing a Ys game. I already reviewed this game ages ago on our channel, but as a recap, they took out a good chunk of what makes a Ys game at its core, which I didn't like, but they also added things that were interesting to me, cool design choices, and they also improved a bit on 8, which was a step in the right direction. I kind of see 8 and 9 as a package deal, two Ys games releasing relatively close to one another, both seeking to give this modern experience to a decade-old series, and both with big stories to tell. The abilities they added were so much fun to mess around with. Although there weren't too many of them, I thought the dungeons were a great part of this game. And I even liked the story a lot too. If it could have just been spread out with more gameplay to bump up that ratio, I could really give this game a higher place on this list. I understand that to modernize a JRPG or any kind of RPG, they usually try to go for a very open experience, but the problem is they may have overshot their budget, they may have overshot what they were capable of producing in these earlier stages of attempting a more open type of experience, which led to these bugs, which led to these performance issues. I don't speak for everyone, but I personally would much prefer to have a more linear, less open world if it means that performance issues and bugs aren't a factor. These ideas that they were going for were really cool, but they may have just been too ambitious. So if you haven't gotten around to it, I would say go into Ys 9 with a really open mind. Don't expect so much a traditional Ys game. Think of it more as a great JRPG to play. And the reason it makes it to this spot on the list above 8 is that when I put them side by side, even if this feels a little bit less like a traditional Ys game, I still liked it and enjoyed it a lot better than I did 8. There were towns, there was really cool gameplay, and again, those dungeons were to die for. I just wish they had more dungeons. I wish there was a lot more dungeons in this game. And speaking of package deals, the next two entries I've grouped together, I'm talking about Ys 1 and 2. I was so happy to finally get a chance to play these games. Personally, as a Ys fan, I've played so many of them before I got the chance to play these, and it really put the series in perspective. You have that great fantasy story. You have unique gameplay with the bump system, which I will get to in just a little bit. Once again, fantastic music and amazing dungeon crawling despite the maps being kind of confusing. This is the Ys formula and there's nothing to improve on it. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. The first Ys game debuted in 1987 for the PC-88, and it was shortly thereafter followed up with the sequel, Ys 2, Ancient Ys Vanished. Since then, these two games have been packaged a lot and redone a couple of times on different platforms. These two games also feature a system that none of the other entries used, and that is the bump system. This is one of the three Ys gameplay systems, and it's incredibly simplistic. You see an enemy, you bump them, they take damage, and hopefully they die before you do. It really doesn't get any simpler than this. I wasn't too sure if this would be for me, but the bump system is actually a pretty good game mechanic, and in my opinion, it's really not harmed by being so oversimplistic. Now that being said, this simplicity had to be outgrown for bigger and better, more fleshed out gameplay design later on, and we will likely never see it again. So I say if you've never tried it, give it a shot. So if I had to give a quick breakdown on these games, they're definitely musts for any Ys fan, but will come with a strong, outdated feel to them that may make these two the only ones on this list that are only for the most dedicated of fans in 2024, and newbies should probably save for later. They are quite punishing at first. Until you get a good sense of how to play the games with their very unique bump system, you will be dying very quickly and oh so very often. Oh, and they are also incredibly easy to get lost in because of some of the dungeons. To explain further, it was definitely my experience that these were games that had 5 to 6 hours of total game time, but because there was a lack of an in-game map and some of the dungeons were incredibly repetitively designed, my playthroughs were pushed to about 12 hours apiece. I can safely say that I was cruising throughout this game very early on, and especially later in 2 this was the case, but once I got to the abandoned mines or the shrines, my progress absolutely flatlined. This is one time when I would not feel bad if you needed to open up an FAQ just to get through these games. After the release of Ys 1 and 2 are Ys games that take this as a foundation. The story, the characters, all the various elements that started right here, and they moved the series forward leaps and bounds with every new entry. So I certainly wouldn't discredit either of these two games. I really enjoyed my playthrough of Ys 1, and I enjoyed Ys 2 a little bit less. With Ys Origin, that's Origin, not Origins, not only was it a great installment in the series, but it was also a really good example for video games in general. Sometimes if a game series gets too tied down to one protagonist, it could grow a little bit stale. So with Ys Origin, they took a step back from the original character, Adol Kristen, and serviced this game as a prequel to give us a little bit more backstory, where we get to play as 3 unique characters. This change of direction worked really well for this title. I maintain to this day, a lot of fans of this game probably liked it because it gave us such a new taste. With Origin, the story takes a step back from the first game, servicing as a prequel, explaining some of the history before our red-headed warrior took center stage. It's still very much the Ys that we love. It features some of the familiar places and faces of the series past, but the player gets to experiment with new characters and slightly different gameplay. It's nuts. All of that getting lost business that some of the previous games had, take and throw that out. It's actually kind of shocking how linear the game is, because that usually isn't the case with JRPGs. In Ys Origin, you don't have to worry about where you're going, just which monsters need slaying and what counts as acceptable forms of moshing in public places. That's right, this game is available on Vita and now on the Switch too, in addition to some other platforms, but you can take Ys Origin on the go. I highly recommend it. I think one of the strong points of Origin is that it has both appeal for new players as well as old, and this is how. Getting lost isn't as much of a thing in Origin, which makes it incredibly easy to pick up, and another great starting point to get into the Ys series, but also for the hardcore folk, because it explores the lore and fills us in on the backstory behind the twin goddesses of Fina and Rhea. It gives us good reason to get through this title. What's more, a true Ys fan will have a lot to love here because there are 3 main routes, with 3 different playable characters and different story outcomes. Basically, you can play as one of 2 characters when you first start the game, and then you unlock the 3rd canon story. It's on the one hand a great narrative that ties into the Ys story, and an insanely fun game because the unlocked secret character is basically Wolverine. I find it hard to find faults with this one. Only thing I could say is that the length of time it could take to complete one of the first available routes before you get the secret canonical story route might take you quite a bit of time. and that might not appeal to everyone. Then you're essentially replaying the same areas all over again, and on top of that, the entire game basically takes place in the towers from the first 2 games, which can really leave the player begging for a change of location. I've also heard that beating all 3 stories unlocks an arena mode, which would possibly be a first for the series. It just seems like such a tall order to have to play through the game 3 times to get to that point. And then I think about how I would rather just play another Ys game if I'm gonna have to put in another 20 hours running up the towers. But all of that being said, my bottom line is this: if you want a great Ys game or the perfect starting point to get into the series, this could be the best because it features a little bit of everything that makes a Ys game a Ys game. And if you still feel like sticking around after, again, this is a prequel, so story-wise, you're at the beginning, my friends. Start your adventure. Now, next on the list, we have Memories of Calcutta. Memories of Calcutta was my entry into this series. This was my starting point, and naturally, that's going to make it pretty high on this list. I have bias for this game because I vividly remember playing it for the first time, and I would give anything to get to play this game for the first time again. The wonderful experience I had playing this for the first time has left a lasting impression on me, and this is probably the reason why I feel drawn to this series to this day. Like with a lot of other fan testimonials, I think the soundtrack was the part that really hooked me, but that's not to discredit the gameplay. On my first playthrough with Memories of Calcutta, I seriously hadn't played an action JRPG like this yet. The game was really refreshing and highly addictive. It really was to me the game version of a page turner, and not just because of the story. Calcutta features a party system where you jump between 3 different characters in an instant to exploit enemy weaknesses with different attack properties like add-all slashing damage or Duran's crushing type attacks. This title had it all. It was at the time becoming my favorite JRPG, and looking back, I would have said that this solitary title is the Ys formula perfected. I would have said that. This was also a strong exclusive for the Vita, which meant while crammed in the back of a car for 3 hours, which was how I played the game for the first time, I was still able to sink my teeth into this sick JRPG. I have talked about this in the past, but I always found it hard to commit to Vita games for some reason. So Calcutta ended up being maybe my 2nd or 3rd Vita game that I actually sat down and went through beginning to end. I think to this day, I get excited thinking about playing my Vita just because of how much of a great time Calcutta turned out to be. The driving force for Calcutta is the goofy townsfolk, the underlying plot, and in general, the premise of this game, which is to go out and do the unthinkable, map the entire Calcuttan forest. Addle's role in this game begins as a muscle for hire type role, but this turns into so much more. Calcutta was a big step for the series too because it finally pulled the camera in a bit more, giving us larger 3D models to look at and a closer look at the world around Addle. This would serve as a major turning point, with Falcom giving us only bigger 3D games ever since. But let's not forget, this is only the 5th game on this list. That places it just about in the middle, and there's a reason for that. That reason that I was quite possibly foreshadowing to, maybe at about 30 seconds previously in this video, to right now this moment, that I am totally not stretching out the border between praising and putting down this game because I don't want to say this. Okay, here goes. As much as I respect and cared about this game, I feel like it hasn't aged too well. Some parts of the game feel slow, and the magic is there, but not 100% all there for me anymore. Replaying even the remastered versions on PS4 and PC, the game showed that it was holding up so-so. Kind of like playing Persona 4 today after having played Persona 5 magnifies the dustiest details about Persona 4. Just coming back to Calcutta today, I wish this game got a remake instead of a remaster. I think it deserves it, and I think enough time has passed to warrant it. But one of those sweet remakes like the Crash Insane trilogy or Spyro, where they just make it look nicer, but it's the same game. So yeah, the graphics feel very outdated. I'm not one to gripe on about graphics, but playing a game that was originally on the Vita and now is on the PS4 just doesn't feel like the way to go. Now let me make myself perfectly clear and express to you that's not to say it's bad, but the thing is, I have played other entries that really take the beloved Ys formula to new heights, outshining this one just a little bit. At the end of the day though, I couldn't be happier with the game that got me into the series. If the only complaint I have now is that it's a little antiquated to come back to, then rest assured I still strongly recommend this game to everyone, especially since it can be played on PC and PS4 now too, and not just limited to the Vita. I think this game is going to be my favorite Ys game, is a thing I said while going through my Ys marathon on my Twitch stream, and I really meant it at the time. Ys, the Oath, and Felghana. Felghana, as I said at the top, is a remake of Ys 3 for the PSP, which was later ported to the PC, and in 2025, it will also be going to the Switch as well. Overall, what this game has more so than any of the other recent releases is how the dungeons are so good that the game feels like a perfect fit to play right after a playthrough of Ys 1 and 2. There is that classic Ys feel to the exploration in Felghana, which is not to be taken lightly. Outside of that, it without a doubt is my second favorite story in the series. Unfortunately, Adol is not a very vivid character outside of combat, being that he is a silent protagonist and whatnot, and in this game especially, we get a powerful narrative of some of the other characters involved in the story, namely that being Chester, Elena, and all of the Ginos Island. Felghana also has some of the strongest platforming in the series. What some of the other games miss is that those dungeons would really benefit from the ability to jump, because the developer is able to incorporate more enjoyable puzzles and obstacles in this way. I loved jumping from moving platforms and even occasionally getting dropped into a hole falling into a completely different area in a lower section of the dungeon. I think a Ys game in general should allow you to jump as Adol. One of the remarkable things about Felghana is that the map is relatively small and the game is possibly the shortest out of this whole list, but it doesn't feel any smaller. I attribute this to the sweet gameplay and the endearing story. Ys, Oath, and Felghana will be a game that Falcom would do good to emulate for all future releases. It does good enough to move forward and yet still feels like a perfect fit with the original games. And all of this, mind you, when the original Ys 3 was a side-scrolling platformer game, which doesn't get a lot of love from the Ys community. No one really wants to talk about that version of Ys 3. They just want to talk about Oath and Felghana because it really brought the story to an experience that was enjoyable. The original Ys 3 was on the Genesis. I heard it wasn't very strong. I never played it, but hey, Falcom took a shot at redoing this game and they did not disappoint one bit. You ever get the feeling that a series with a lot of installments, especially a JRPG or an RPG in general, starts to feel a little bit samey? Like, wow, if some crazy guy just went out and tried to play 3 or 4 of these games back to back on his stream, he might get just a little bit tuckered out. Well, that's where Ys X, the Ark of Nepishtim, comes into play. Although I heard a lot of mixed things about this game, some people even mentioning that they did not like it, this game really was a breath of fresh air. Different enough to break the monotony of playing a game series with over 10 installments, although granted that at the time there were only 6, not including the remakes, and yet action-packed enough to justify its place with the best of them. This game is a total left turn at times, but not in any major dramatic way like 9 felt, or at times 8. And this will not be the last time that I mention Ys 8 here. Nepishtim has a few key differences in how it plays, including more grindiness than usual and a larger focus on backtracking with less areas to explore overall. The game hosts an even smaller map, but despite that, the I'm lost and don't know where to go factor that we come to expect from this series was probably the strongest in 1 and 2, but then followed by 6. Players will still be very directionless at times, although tackling the issue of progression was usually just a matter of talking to everyone in town. I would say that Ys X is like a second cousin of Ys, but a really cool one. And you know what else is really cool about this game? The concept and theme, which I can't help but think back to 8. Adol washes ashore on an island, except that this one isn't deserted. You even get to encounter some pirates that he was traveling with before the unfortunate circumstance happened where he went overboard. These characters, among some of the many in Napishtim, are well fleshed out, have distinct personalities, and make the cutscenes really pop. What makes for a really good adventure game here is a world that gives you cool characters to meet all over the place, which by comparison feels lacking in 8. The level design for the dungeons and towns is another strong point, not to mention some absolutely breathtaking and impressive backdrops. The last dungeon of the game especially sold me on the level design, and the final boss was so very different and yet so very Ys boss-like. I would venture to say that this game feels like it has the theme of 8, but does it better, with the gameplay in the style of Origin, only super up-resed. Seriously, if I was complaining about how Ys Calcutta looks, Ys Napishtim is the exact opposite. This game is beautiful. What is also really unique to Napishtim is that this is part of one of 2 direct connections in the series. Now time out, Mash, what are you talking about? The Ys series has a core timeline that begins with Origins and all of Adol's bloopers and blunders follow thereafter, right? Well, the important thing here is that while this may be true, honestly every Ys game has the you can start with this one quality to it. Because if we're being honest, a lot of them work well as standalone titles. And at that, you can't fault someone for picking up a random game in the series and thinking it has nothing to do with the others. Usually, it's a lot of vague hints, references, or other mentions to the past that only deep-diving, hardcore fans would catch. So what I'm trying to drive home here is that in a series that feels mostly disconnected between each game, getting a direct sequel is a pretty cool experience, and we have that here. Just like with Ys 1 and 2, Ys 6 goes into Ys 7, and that makes these 2 sets of games, 1 and 2 and 6 and 7, the only direct links in the series to date. They're immediate sequels story-wise, and we don't have that with any of the other entries. In Napishtim, a few of the characters will become important in the next one, and I really like that. But for the sake of spoiler, I'm not going to say any more than that. As we can see, linking 1 and 2 and 6 and 7 is especially unique for this JRPG series. And I don't know enough about the development of these 2 games, but I guess they were trying to do direct sequels again after several titles where we're not necessarily being directly connected. And that's why, in the case of Ys at least, 6 isn't afraid of 7, it directly links into it. There's my dad joke for the video. You don't have to play 6 before you play 7. I didn't, but the thing is, I kinda wish I did. And despite being a game that feels so different from the rest of the series, it still ends up being one of my favorite Ys games that I can't wait to go back and play one day. This game really sets itself apart from the rest of the series, and I gotta say, sometimes change is good. And there's one more game that's going to make it onto this list. Now, originally when I played Ys Memories of Calcutta, that was my favorite. I thought it was such a great example of the series before, but since then, that has changed. My tone has changed on that topic because I have found what I believe to be Ys Perfected, and that is none other than Ys 7. That's right. Apart from the fact that jumping isn't in this game, which is kind of weird if you think about it, since 7 is a direct sequel to 6. 7 is a perfect example of everything that I love about this series. See how I keep saying that word over and over again? Those 7 golden letters, perfect. I can't drive this point home any further. This game is Ys Perfected. I think the 2 strongest things that this game has going for it is that it has my favorite soundtrack in the whole series, I can finally say that, and the best story to go with it. This story has an incredible gut punch of a climax that I won't spoil for you, which is funny because I may have neglected to talk about story in this whole video up to this point, and that could largely be that story isn't always the strongest point for this series. Not to say that it's bad, but it usually is the gameplay, art, and music that most people get into this franchise for, and that is what resonates to a lot of us first and foremost. But not trailing too far behind are lovable characters and endearing story that these games do feature as well. Well, 7 just hits emotionally on another level. The level of detail that the plot goes to about the conflict ensuing around Adol and the political landscape outside of just the region that we're in is top notch for this series. The story we get to experience in the city of Altago is, I would say, Shakespearean. It has a certain medieval revenge, betrayal, snarky wit, bleakness to it, all blended up like the greatest bard that ever lived is reciting his captivating tales around a campfire. The Ys series is really good with throwing an unexpected curveball with a plot. It's something that I honestly look forward to every time I play a Ys game for the first time. And like I said before, this game features an emotional gut punch, and it is, in my opinion, the biggest pull you'll experience in all of the Ys games. You can expect a lot of dialogue in 7 because of how deep the story is, and the players are treated to several chapters worth of cutscenes. This one is going to be for those of us that really want to get hooked on the plot. That being said, the game doesn't cut corners elsewhere. It is still incredibly fun to play, with plenty of these staples present. You will be spending time grinding in dungeons to level up, score tons of cash, and run back to towns to purchase better gear so you can suit up for the bosses. Titano fights are great too, and very rewarding to go hunt down. Not to mention, this game introduced the party system, which is now the de facto system for Ys games, with 8, 9, and Kelketa following suit. Basically, in 7, they added playable allies that you can select to fight, swapping on the fly and using one of the 3 attack types to expose enemy weaknesses. I think this would be another reason why Ys 7 is Ys perfected. It is my belief that the system will never return to either of the 2 previous systems because this one is the best fit for the series and it's way more diverse to play by comparison. It gives the game a really nice flavor of variety that maybe was missing in the past. With all of that being wrapped, Ys 7 takes the spot as the best Ys game in the series. It has great art, the best story, the best soundtrack, and it even changed the way that we play Ys to this day. Save for the lack of jumping as a gameplay mechanic, it doesn't get any better than Ys 7. If you're gonna play any of the Ys games, I recommend you play Ys 7, you won't regret it. And that's just my opinion. Guys, I wanted to make a video just expressing my love for this series. This is my favorite JRPG series of all time. After my marathon, I had so many things to say about these games that I couldn't help but talk to you about it and give you 9 great excuses to get into this series. Ys really is just a fantastic franchise that I think deserves way more credit than it gets for being an early pioneer of the JRPG genre. And it's only evolved more and more with each new installment. I could go on and on about this series, and I would absolutely love to, but we had plenty of my opinions. We want to hear your opinions. Let us know in the comments below. Have you played the Ys series before? Do you have a favorite one? How did your list stack up with my list? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe as well. Really hope to do something like this again in the future. A lot went into this video, so we can't promise one coming out anytime soon. Yeah, this was the first time we ever got to rank an entire series. Maybe we'll get to do it again. Who knows? But definitely make sure to stick around for all sorts of great content that we got, Ys or otherwise. And we're still not done with the month of October Ys content. We got a couple more videos left to go. We hope you enjoy it. We've also still been playing Ys Origin on the side as a playthrough for the channel, so make sure to check that out as well. To all the Ys fans out there, thank you so much for checking out this video. I hope my opinions didn't make you too mad. I'm curious to hear what all of your opinions are, and yeah, thank you so much. This is Mash the Stampede for Toostupidgamerz signing out. We'll see you on the next video.